the essence of hot rodding is taking a car you have that you love and trying to make it better. You know, the backbone of our hobby is a lot of guys that just love cars and love the camaraderie that comes with the car. We all enjoy looking at the cars, see what other guys are doing to their cars and talking about your vehicle. But the great part of it is the friends you meet that share the same kind of passion you do.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merritt, and greetings to all of you listening far and wide from places like Fort Mill, South Carolina, Petoskey, Michigan, Pflugerville, Texas, Shimla, India, La Maddalena, Sardinia, Italy, and Swindon, England. Well, I don't know about you, but my summer is absolutely flying by. I can't believe how fast it's going. So I hope you're getting out there and enjoying some cool drives and events. And as for me, I've been out on my motorcycle a little bit, and I'm making some progress on a few garage projects, which I'm way behind on. And of course, I'm looking forward to Monterey Car Week, which is just around the corner. And I've got some exciting news for you. One of the biggest events of the week is the Quail, a motorsports gathering, which is held at the Quail Lodge and Golf Club in Carmel, California. And this year, I'll be interviewing the legendary Emerson Fittipaldi live on stage at the Quail, and I'm absolutely thrilled about that, as you can imagine. It's not every day I get to sit down with a Formula One champion and an Indy 500 winner, after all, and he did both of those things not once, but twice. So if you're attending the Quail, my fireside chat with Emo is scheduled for 1:45 p.m., and it should be a great conversation. Be sure to say hello if you're there. And we're going to release that as a podcast episode as well, so look for that in the near future. Make sure you're following Horsepower Heritage on your favorite podcast app. Leave me 5 stars and a quick review if you can. That's a big help. Also, remember, I'll be launching the Horsepower Heritage email newsletter soon, and that'll have news and tidbits from across the car culture, something to enjoy over your morning coffee. And that'll be released once a month. But I promise you won't get any spam or anything, just good car stuff. It's easy to sign up for the newsletter. Just go to horsepowerheritage.com, click on the contact button, and then send me your email and say, subscribe me to the newsletter. And that's all there is to it. Now, today I've got a terrific chat for you. My guest is Rick Love, president of Vintage Air. And if you're a hot rodder or a muscle car owner, you probably already know that name because Vintage Air has been designing and selling a line of automotive AC systems since 1976 to help you keep cool in your classic car. Rick is a lifelong hot rodder himself, and we had a great discussion about the hot rod scene. And, you know, he's so knowledgeable. Just a fun conversation. By the way, check out Rick's 39 Ford Coupe on the Horsepower Heritage Instagram page. It's a beautiful car. And we talked quite a bit about that car, so it'll give you a point of reference. You got to see it for yourself. And as always, there are links in the show notes for everything we talk about. And if you enjoy the podcast, support what I'm doing. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage, and you can donate as little as $2, or you can do a monthly support donation too. Thanks to all of you who step up and do that, by the way. I really appreciate it. And if you donate, I'll send you some Horsepower Heritage decals to slap on your toolbox or your coffee mug or whatever. All right, well, get ready for hot rods and cool rides with my guest, Rick Love of Vintage Air. And that's coming up right after this. This episode of Horsepower Heritage is sponsored by Model Citizen Diecast. No matter what's in your garage, you can fit all your automotive heroes on a shelf. And they've got you covered, whether it's 1/43rd scale, 1/18th scale, or even the ginormous 1/8 scale masterpieces from the Amalgam Collection. Go to modelcitizendiecast.com and get 10% off when you use the promo code HERITAGE at checkout. Limitations apply. From race cars to street cars and everything in between, it's Model Citizen Diecast, because your inner child still wants to play with cars.
Rick, thanks for coming on the show. Great to see you.
You too. I'm excited about it. Looking forward to it.
Okay, good. We'll roll right into it. But I have to say, I love your 39 Ford Coupe. It's beautiful. I'm sure it performs really well. but so it's got a beautiful blue paint job and the most classic flames I've ever seen on the front end. I mean, it's absolutely gorgeous, Rick.
Man, I appreciate that very much. That car is like a part of the family. I mean, I've had that car longer than I've been married. I mean, it's going on, next year will be 40 years I've had that car. And it, for a while, was the only car I owned. I drove it every day. I tore it apart a few years ago, about 2014, actually, coming back from the LA Roadster Show, the Father's Day Roadster Show. The motor finally went away on it. It had over 180,000 miles on it at that point, and it started kind of going away. So that was an excuse to kind of tear it apart and update it a little bit. When I built that car originally, it was basically in a one-car garage at a house that I was renting as a 21-year-old kid and everything, with some help with friends and everything to do it. So, it had lacquer paint that we had done in a friend of mine's garage and all of that. And some of the things I kind of took some shortcuts on because I wasn't able to afford a whole lot of things for it at that point. I was able to update when I rent to it, but I still loved the look of the car. I wanted it to look the same way it did back then. So we took a lot of photos and made some measurements so that, and we ended up stripping the car down to bare metal. And when we put it back together, we tried to make it look as close to the original way that we did it as we could, only a little better this time. The door gaps are a whole lot better. The panels line up a whole lot better than they did originally. So I'm really happy to have it back on the road again. I drive it often. I drive to work a lot.
Talking about having just a little money in your pocket and trying to squeeze every penny on a build, that's sort of the story of hot rodding and street rodding, really. I mean,
very much so. I mean, the essence of hot rodding is taking a car you have that you love and trying to make it better in performance, better in the way it looks. And I mean, that's kind of the essence of hot rodding. And, the backbone of our hobby or sport, whatever, you want to call it in that respect, industry, is a lot of guys that just love cars and love the camaraderie that comes with the car thing. And I think that's the most important thing. When you go to some kind of event, whether it be a rod runner, a good guy show, NSRA show, or concours, anything like that, I mean, really the most enjoyable part of it, we all enjoy looking at the cars, see what other guys are doing to their cars and talking about your vehicle. But the great part of it is the friends you meet and the people that you get to know there that share the same interests you do and share the same kind of passion you do for the cars and the workmanship that's in them. And that's the part that I really enjoy. It's the people part of it. I think this industry has the greatest people anywhere.
Yeah, so you've been in the industry pretty much your whole professional career, right? I mean, these cars have defined your living.
Yeah, kind of to a certain extent. Actually, before I worked full-time at Vintage Air, I actually started my career. My college degree is in electronics, electronic technology, and I started working for a company back in the early 80s that manufactured and made simulators. Everything from amusement ride simulators to the driver simulators that you used in high schools and stuff, to teach kids how to drive. And that's what I did as a full-time job, and did a lot of traveling and a lot of international work with the ride simulators. And the byproduct of that international work was I would work 2 or 3 weeks overseas, and then I'd come back and I'd have some time off. And I would use that time off to either work on my own car, or I actually started a side business to where I was doing wiring and air conditioning in old cars for guys. And that's where I met Jack Chisenhall, and who founded Vintage Air, and got to be friends with Jack and was a dealer for Vintage Air and started doing a lot of Vintage Air installations. And that's kind of how I got into the company, started doing a little more with the company and doing some shows, doing power tour with them and doing some R&D projects with them. In fact, interestingly, my 39 Ford was without a doubt the first street rod, I would guess, that had 134A refrigerant. When Jack first started experimenting with it back in 1990, 89 and 90, long before it was mandated, that he could see it coming, that mandate was coming, we started experimenting with different components, condensers, compressors, and things like that, and had access to the sand and wind tunnel in Dallas. And we started working with it, and that's how Jack got into 134A and with the effects on a street rod and the different components that you had to use to make it work properly.
Is that 39 Ford your first really special car?
Yeah, well, yeah, I had a GTO in high school, and that we did quite a bit of work on and everything. But yeah, when I got that 39, before that I had my first hot rod was really a 40 Chevy Coupe that I sold my GTO to get. And, it was a small block car and all that. That was kind of how I cut my teeth in it. And then I had a chopped 40 Pontiac two-door sedan that I put quite a few miles on, drove to California and all of that. But then when I bought that 39, I had always wanted a 44 Coupe. That's what I wanted when I bought that 40 Chevy Coupe, but I couldn't find a 44 I could afford. I just love the look of a 39 Deluxe 44 Coupe. I think they're one of the prettiest cars. The proportions on them are just so good. I think they're one of the prettiest cars that Ford ever made. And when I sold my Pontiac, I had a few more dollars in my pocket then. And that was my number one choice was a 39 Deluxe because I liked the 1-year grill on it and I liked the headlights. And I was looking for a 39 Deluxe or a 40 Standard. And I actually found this 39 at the Nats North in Detroit, Michigan in 1984. And I'm third owner of the car. The guy I bought it from the original owner, and he kind of built a hot rod out of it in the early 70s, and he drove it up till the early 80s, and that's when I bought it from him. That car had one of the first, when I started working on it, I came to find out it had one of the first 10 Ron Francis wiring kits that he sold when he went into business in the early 70s. That's long gone now, but I saved some of the parts of it and actually sent it to the Ron Francis guys for their archives because it was an early kit for them.
What's under the hood of the 39?
When I first built the car, the guy I bought it from in Detroit had just built a brand new 350 for it. And a place called General Dynamics Machine or something there built the motor for him. And it was a good, strong 350. And that's what was in it for, 180,000 miles plus. And then when I did the rebuild a few years ago, a good friend of mine, John McLeod, who owned Classic Instruments, also did some work on the side, and they had built a 57 Chevrolet for a guy and put a ZZ4 motor in it, put a little better cam in it, but it was basically a ZZ4. And after 1,000 miles, the guy decided he wanted a big block. So they jerked that ZZ4 out, and I picked up that ZZ4 from John. So it's got a ZZ4 Chevrolet small block in it. Like I said, a little different cam, and now it's got a Phytech fuel injection that we put on it when I rebuilt it. But it's just a basic old small block.
Yeah, I think a lot of people wonder, why do so many routers put a Chevy engine in a Ford? But what's your perspective on that? I know why, but tell everyone.
Well, there's two reasons. And the biggest reason in many cases is the measurements. The small block Chevrolet fits in everything. I've got a little 32 Coupe as well that's got a small block in it. And the dimensions of a small block Chevrolet with the distributor in the back worked out really well with the stock firewalls on the early Fords. And they were a good swap for a flathead, and the dimensions of the motor fit really well. And they were also really plentiful and cheap, more so than a Ford, And you got plenty of dyed-in-the-wool Ford guys that have a Ford small block or big block or whatever in a hot rod. But, predominantly you see a Chevrolet. And a lot of the reason for that is due to the dimensions and how cheap and available not only the Chevy small block was, but the parts were. Ford parts are more expensive. And the front part of a Ford motor is longer, made it harder to put a good fan in. And that's a lot of the reasons you see the Chevys.
Yeah, they're practical. Like you said, parts all day long, cheap parts all day long. It seems like there's a dividing line, right? And the dividing line is, if you're not going to do a Ford flathead V8, you're going to move to a Chevy.
Although, you're seeing more Fords all the time. And I think, a lot of that, I give the credit to that to Roy Brizio, because he got in with Angelo at Ford Motorsports. And, Chevy was the first one that really had crate motors available. And then I think when Roy got really heavy into the Fords, he got Ford going in the crate motor business. And I give Roy a lot of credit for pushing that. And I think that was a big part in getting more Ford small blocks into hot rods, was that Ford had the crate motor program after that in the Ford Motorsports engines. And then, also when you started having more of the dealerships, the places like, up in Lubbock, Stog-and-Dickey, that had crate motors available, their own versions of crate motors. And gosh, these days, everyone from Blueprint Motors to, so many of the guys, Don Hardy, so many of the guys that are doing bolt-in crate motors, I think that's changed things a lot as well.
By the way, do you have an automatic in that 39 or are you shifting?
I did for years. That had a turbo 350 for years. And, when I first had it, and that was back in the 55 mile an hour days, and that had a turbo 350 with that 350 and a Ford 9-inch with 355 gears in the back. And, you'd run down the road all day long at 3,000 RPM plus and never think anything about it. And down the road, though, I'm kind of a 3-pedal guy in a hot rod. So it's got now several years ago, even before the rebuild, I've got a T5, a world-class T5 in it. So it's got a 5-speed.
I love shifting. I wouldn't trade a manual gearbox in almost any vehicle for an automatic. That's just me. But I like to be busy, behind the wheel. By the way, you got a mild chop on that car, right?
39, no, that is stock height.
Wow, I don't know. It's fooling my eye, I guess, because maybe it's the stance or whatever, but it just looks like you got a slight chop.
When they're low, they look good and everything, and full fendered. But as I said earlier, I think the proportions on a 3940 coupe are some of the best that Ford ever did. And I've seen a few mild chops, an inch or so that'll look good. Troy Ladd did one a few years ago for the Street Rodder Road Tour car that looked really good. But man, I've seen a whole lot of 40 Fords screwed up with a chop. Now 32 Ford to me and a 32 Ford, they're full fendered car. Again, the old opinion thing, a full fendered car, I think a stock height looks good. But man, when I think of a 5-window 32 like I have, I think of John Milner and his American Graffiti coupe. And
that's right.
3.5-inch chop, which is about perfect.
Oh yeah. I love Milner's yellow 32. Yeah. In that film. That's a great movie. I was just watching that movie about a week ago. Fantastic.
It's still, even after all these years, that movie still, if it'll come on, if you're switching channels, it's one of those you kind of have to stop and watch some.
Yeah, and it's so cool that it's George Lucas's kind of Valentine to his youth, in Modesto.
Yeah. And again, even in that movie, as much as anything else, the people play a huge role in the movie as well as the cars. The cars are a part of it, but it's how the people interact with each other and interact with the cars that are a big part of that movie.
Oh, yeah, no question about it. I love it. You were talking earlier about some really key players in the hot rod industry, Roy Brizio and Ron Francis. And you guys at Vintage Air have been key players too. But tell me about how the company started. I know you weren't with the company from day one, but let's talk about how the company started and when you got involved.
Our company was founded by Jack Chisenhall in 1976. And Jack, after his time in the Air Force, he always wanted to get into manufacturing. So after he graduated or got out of the Air Force, went to school for manufacturing engineering, but he'd always been a tinkerer. He built his first hot rod when he was in his teens, a Model A with a Pontiac motor. And living in San Antonio, Texas, as warm as it is here, that was always something in the back of his mind. And when he got out of the Air Force and decided what he was going to do to be manufacturing, air conditioning was what he thought about. And a good friend of his dad's was a distributor for Mark IV, which was an aftermarket air conditioning company back in the 70s. And Jack became a dealer and started doing installations in, at that time, you could still buy quite a few cars without AC. Dodge or Ford, a lot of pickups you bought without AC, and you could get kits for them to add AC to these cars. And that's what Jack started doing then started using that technology to make kits specifically designed for hot rods. And he bought a thermoforming machine and started making his own molds and started designing an under dash and behind the dash system designed specifically for the packaging constraints that you had in pre-48 vehicles. That was his first basic target, was the pre-48 cars. And Pete Chaporis from Pete and Jake's and was one of Jack's early supporters. And they put Aaron the California Kid and they got that going. And then Boyd Coddington was another guy that Boyd was building the high-end cars then, the early 80s, and Boyd was a big believer in air conditioning for those cars, and Jack got involved with him. So that's kind of where the company grew from then. And then in the mid-80s, Jack kind of got into, starting to see that there were more of the later model cars, in his eyes, later models was the Tri-5s, 55, 57 Chevys. And that's when he designed the first, what we call now our SureFit series, which was a system designed specifically for a vehicle. And that was the first one was the 57 Chevy. And he built a kit that was designed to bolt in to stock locations, work off the factory control panel so you could retain that factory look. And that kind of was the earliest, the originator of our SureFit series.
Yeah, and so you guys have kits that are model specific for Mustangs, Camaros, G-body, GM cars, right?
Yep, it started. We've got 165, I think, right now, different bolt-in model specific SureFit kits. And the Tri-5 Chevys were first. And then, one of the reasons for those kits, the difference really between the pre-48 and the post-48 cars, when you're building a hot rod, in my eyes, a hot rod, a pre-48 car, you're doing more building of a car. I mean, you're kind of determining where your steering column is going to go and where your pedals are going to go and all of that. So you're using a more universal type system. Like we said earlier, you may put a Ford, you may put a Chevrolet, you may put, something else in there. When you start getting into the mid-50s, kind of that platform is pretty well designed and pretty well laid out. So if you've got a 57 Chevy, you're probably going to have at the time was a small block or maybe a big block, perhaps a 6-cylinder, and even now you may have an LS or an LT or something, but the steering column is pretty well defined. Where the pedals are is pretty well defined. And that's right up through the, like you said, the Camaros and pickups and all of that. So now we can take and design a system around those parameters. You have good mounting points in the firewall that are well defined, and they're going to be pretty much the same car to car. So that's where we kind of made that break in the kits that were designed specifically for a platform.
Rick, you talked earlier about how, Boyd was one of the early supporters and all that. You've gotten to know so many industry people over the years personally as friends. Who's been the most influential to you in your career?
Man, there's been a few. And, Jack for sure. I mean, I was a 21-year-old kid when I met Jack. I had just moved to San Antonio. I had that chopped 40 Pontiac I mentioned, and it didn't have air conditioning. And I wanted to make a trip out to Merced, California, to the Western Nats out there, and go to Modesto, actually, and see where American Graffiti was filmed. And I bought at a swap meet an old AC kit, an old underdash AC unit, and that's what I was going to throw in the car. And I went to Vintage Air, and I had met Jack a time or two before, but we got to talk, and make a long story short there, he basically went in the back and found a returned unit that had some scratches in it, stuff like that, and gave it to me because he didn't want me running out to California with some junk in my car and everything. So that was kind of the beginning of a good wing. We were friends before I ever worked for him. And so Jack was always been real influential. And through Jack, that's who I met a lot of guys. I met Tom Medley through Jack. And man, Tom Tom had been around from the beginning of Hot Rod Magazine and up through Rod and Custom and all of that. And after I actually came to work for Jack full time in the late 90s, I was spending a lot of time out in California with distributors and everything. And I'd stay on Tom's couch. I'd sleep at Tom's couch in Burbank where he lived. And I spent a lot of time with Tom and got a lot of knowledge from him. And Pete Chaporis was another one from Pete and Jake's. I mean, Pete was a really smart guy. And Pete understood marketing as well as how to build a hot rod. And so he was another one that would share that. And I think Pete was really influential in trying to bring our industry along from a backyard industry to a more refined industry. And a lot of the influences he had on businesses behind the scenes for that, I think he was really influential. And man, some of the other guys that were hot rod heroes I've gotten to know, guys like, Art Morrison and Bobby Alloway and Troy Trepanier and, some of the newer guys, Mike and Jim Ring of the Ring Brothers and all of these builders that have gotten to be friends through the years. And man, I am so fortunate in that respect that I've been able to meet and get to know some of these guys. Because like I said earlier, greatest guys anywhere. Just such a great fraternity.
By the way, you mentioned Tom Medley, and in case people don't know, he was one of the very first guys on the scene in after World War II, got involved with Peterson Publishing, and he created a cartoon character, a comic strip character named Stroker McGurk. And that was a great way to sort of poke fun at the whole hot rodding scene.
Yeah, he said that name came from a guy in the service. And he said, if you were lazy and you were just kind of getting by, you were a stroker. That's kind of where Stroker McGurk came from. And then, Tom was one of the first guys out at Bonneville doing both photos and video out in Bonneville back in the late 40s and 50s and up through the 60s and everything. And yeah, if you've been around the hot rod world a long time, the name Tom Medley, because he was editor of Rod and Custom and said he was around a long time. Some of the younger guys may not know him all that well, but man, again, he a lot of behind the scenes influences he had through the years, and just a great all around guy. I mean, he rode with me on several of our road tours, and talk about a guy that had some stories from everything from World War II, when he was there at Battle of the Bulge in World War II and in Bastogne and all of those times, and then up through the Bonneville years and all of that in the 60s when hot rodding was growing up and everything. Just a great guy that had so many good stories.
Yeah, that's awesome. Fantastic life that guy led. I remember inheriting my cousin's 50s and 60s issues of Hot Rod magazine and seeing Stroker McGurk in there and wondering, what is this all about? But, pretty cool stuff.
Very cool stuff. I said he was a treasure. I mean, he was one, and I mean, he's, I think, in every Hot Rod Hall of Fame there is, and rightfully so, because he was a guy also that was really influential with Jack, because Tom was a driver. I mean, he would get in a T-Bucket or a 32 Roadster and drive from Southern California to the Street Rod Nationals in Memphis when that wasn't all that common. You had Tom would do it with Bud Bryan back then, and, Pete and Jake and Brian Brennan that's, still in the magazine industry. Those guys would get in their cars and go cross country. They call them the Wild Bunch from some of the stuff that they got into on the road. But that's another thing those guys were really influential on, because a lot of the early hot rods were not all that roadworthy. I mean, you had a couple 100 miles to an event and back, and these guys really started running cross country. And then when the events started growing up, and I think that's been a big part of the growth of our industry, is that you're able to drive your cars now. I mean, the suspensions that are available now, the climate control systems, the engines that are available now and everything that you can get, and the reliability of parts, you don't mind getting a car and driving 2,000 miles to an event.
I was just going to ask you about that, because it seems to me that the biggest change over the decades in hot rodding has been the growth of the aftermarket industry and all the choices that you have now. Nobody goes to a junkyard anymore to find their parts, and of course the internet has changed things as well.
Oh yeah.
Also, reliability of all these components is far beyond what it was in the 50s and 60s.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. I mean, and you've seen some really nice cars built 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. I mean, they all weren't junk by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, the 40 Chevy I built originally, just about everything came out of the junkyard for that. I mean, that's just what you did back then. But times changed. Junkyards have changed. I mean, heck, you don't even call them junkyards anymore. I think they're recycling centers or whatever they are anymore. And I was a junkyard dog. I loved running through a junkyard and finding parts and stuff like that. I had some great times doing that. But, being able to purchase brand new parts that are specifically designed for what you're doing now, I mean, that's made such a difference. And, back then when I first built that car, I had a whole lot more time than anything else. So, getting an old part and redoing it, working it to the car was one thing. But now I think all of us, our lives are just so much busier now, it seems like, than they were 30, 40 years ago. And we don't have that time. It's nice now to buy a part that's designed for your vehicle to bolt on. The quality is so good. And they still have a lot of different varieties of parts where you can tailor a car and personalize a car.
Yeah, and of course, junkyards aren't full of pre-war cars anymore. And
right.
I'm sure there's a lot of young guys out there who are going to salvage yards, getting parts for their, Japanese tuned car or something like that. But yeah, so we just have a lot more choices is my point.
And I'm not even saying one's better than the other, because you can. No, you can. I've seen some really great cars, and it's great that you brought up the younger guys with what they're doing. One of our sales guys here has got an early 90s Nissan that he's doing. And I mean, man, he's lowered that car and he's improving the brakes and he's putting body kits on it and everything. I mean, he's building his hot rod, and it's great to see he's doing it just like we did when I was younger. He works here, he saves his money, he buys a part here, he buys a part there, and they're trading out work and everything where they're doing things with his buddies. And you love to see that. And I mean, that's his version of a hot rod, and he still gets some parts out in salvage yard for it. And there's nothing wrong with that.
And also that brings up another point, which is that your air conditioning systems are not just for hot rods or muscle cars. You can install them in all sorts of machines.
Yep. I mean, I was talking to Jim Ring yesterday, and they've got our system. They're rebuilding a Rolls Royce they're going to debut at SEMA this year. So, I mean, yeah, there's that. And I mean, in the last, probably 10, 12 years, and I mean, trucks have become such a huge part of the aftermarket hot rod, muscle car, whatever you want to call that portion of the industry. But gosh, trucks are huge now. And I mean, the number of aftermarket parts available for the trucks, and just the level of builds you see people doing on trucks now, it has, pickups, everything has changed dramatically from what it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's the resto mod scene, and
yeah,
it's a big tent.
Yeah, and that tent continues to grow every year. I mean, one of our newest kits we just debuted, our newest Gen 5 kit, is for an OBS for the 88 to 94 Chevrolet pickups. And I mean, a few years ago, we'd have never thought that much about that. But that's a 30-plus-year-old truck now in some respects. And parts are hard to find. And, technology has changed since then. And, man, they're great-looking trucks. I would drive one. When I first heard the term OBS, I didn't even know what OBS meant. And one of the guys, that's the old body style. I thought, old body style? I bought one of those trucks that was brand new. What do you mean old body style? But they're still great looking trucks. They're a great size, and they're easy to work on. Again, they have everything that makes a hot rod cool.
Rick, I had Mike and Jim Ring on the show not long ago. We talked about that. We talked about that Rolls Royce. I'm really excited to see that build.
It's going to be a great car. I mean, those guys have such a vision on things. In addition to being, and I listened to some of the podcasts, and it came through as to what interesting guys they are. I mean, they're great guys on top of it, as well as being really talented builders. But yeah, that's just another example, of what a hot rod is.
Rick, I think it would be helpful if we kind of went to air conditioning 101, going back to high school physics class, right? So the basic principle behind air conditioning is that a compressed gas cools as it expands, right?
Really, the thing about air conditioning is, and it's interesting you mentioned physics, because that's exactly what it is. I mean, what you're doing with air conditioning is you're taking a refrigerant and you are circulating that refrigerant through the system through two different heat exchangers. And inside your car is the evaporator, and that's where the evaporation takes place. And then basically you have a compressor that's usually on the engine. You have a condenser in front of the radiator. You have some hoses and some other small parts, a receiver dryer in some cases, or an accumulator in some cases, but you have the evaporator inside the car. And you circulate that refrigerant through the car. When it evaporates inside the car, you're basically taking the heat inside the car. You pull it in through a blower, blow it across some coils, and that warmer air evaporates the refrigerant. And as it evaporates the refrigerant, it absorbs the heat from that air. And that's the cool air you feel on your face, or your cool air you feel in the car is basically the same air with an absence of heat. And then you pull that gas refrigerant into the compressor, compress it, push it through the condenser where you condense it to a liquid again. And as you condense it to a liquid, it dissipates the heat. So you have the heat exchanger in the front that takes the heat out of that refrigerant that was absorbed inside the vehicle. And then you start the whole cycle over again. So basically you're removing heat from inside a closed area and dissipating it from the outside. And it's really important to think about it that way, because there's so many cases we'll get people call up, or we'll talk to people at a show, or I'll be everything. They say, geez, my air conditioning's just not working quite right. The pressures are right, everything's right, but it's just not cool. Well, you come to find out that the car's not well insulated or sealed up from the outside. And if you can't seal and insulate the vehicle, you're never going to be comfortable with it. It's like your house. It's the same type of system in your house. If you have the windows and doors open in your house while the air conditioning's running, you're never going to be comfortable in the house. And it's the same way in your car. If you can't keep that heat out of the car, you're not going to be able to bring that cabin temperature down to where it's going to be comfortable for you.
What's the strangest car you've ever seen a vintage air system installed on?
Ooh, strangest one. Boy, that's... Jay Leno's got a few different ones. He's putting our one of our systems in a Detroit Electric car that he has. So that's been an interesting project through the years. And, Mike and Jim, speaking of Mike and Jim, they've got the Enyo that won Battle of the Builders at SEMA last year with our AC on it. And, but we've done some other things too overseas. Several of the supercars overseas have our systems in them as well. So that's pretty cool to have. And so that's probably, unusual. That's I said the Rolls Royce. Some of the things we never even know because people buy our systems and you don't know what they end up going in. But we've even used our systems in some interesting equipment, some type of equipment that people use and things like that.
I'm sure if you go to a car show on any weekend, you're looking around to see who's got your systems installed, right?
Always. Yep. And I love that. I mean, one of the most fun things I do at a show is just walking around and looking at people's cars because number one, is a guy that did a lot of installations before I came to work for Vintage Air. I always wanted to see what other guys were doing, how they were hiding things, the way they were integrating some vents and controls into the dashes and things. And I always look at that. And man, I love talking to our customers and talking to them about how they came up with some of these ideas and all of that. I love seeing how guys put our systems in their vehicles because we try to give them a whole lot of choices that allows them to personalize their vehicles like everybody else in our industry. And that's one of my favorite things is getting to talk to our customers and seeing how they're using our systems.
It is so important to have the visible parts of the system look like they belong there. And so you guys have put a lot of design and engineering work into that aspect of your products.
Yeah, and I think that's an important part of any car build from front to rear. If you go to a show or you're watching TV or you're looking through a magazine or something, I mean, sometimes cars, trucks, whatever will catch your eye. And it may not be the most expensive car there by any stretch of the imagination, but the car follows a theme from front to rear. The guy had a theme in mind when he started, and everything from the front bumper to the back of the car goes along with that same theme. And again, it doesn't have to be a high dollar car, but if the stance is right, if it sits right, and the parts are correct on it, you can make a really inexpensive car look great and choosing the right parts. And we try to be a part of that. We try to have, black parts. We try to have polished parts. We have chrome parts. We have different shapes. We have different looks. And to try to make sure that we're able to meld in and fit the theme that a customer has in mind when he's building a vehicle. Some guys want a high-tech look. Some guys want something that looks more back 40s, 50s, 60s. So we try to have options available where you can use our system and make it look like an integrated part of the vehicle.
Those old aftermarket AC systems from the 60s and 70s, I remember them being just enormous under the dash. Like they would take up a lot of space over the transmission tunnel. You guys have sort of worked on miniaturizing things too, though, right?
Sure. You try to a certain extent, but as we talked just a few minutes ago, physics still come into play. You've got an AC coil that has to absorb heat, and a coil has a certain amount of capacity. So if you've got a great big large vehicle, you've got to be able to match that coil size to be able to absorb the heat from that size vehicle. It's just like with a house, you talk about having a 1-ton unit or a 2-ton unit, depending on the size of the house or anything. It's the same way with your vehicle. You've got to have an AC unit that's large enough to handle the amount of cubic space you have inside the vehicle. And you've also got to have a large enough condenser to work with that AC on the outside to be able to dissipate that heat. So a lot of it comes down to that basic physics that you can't outrun physics.
You just made me think of something, Rick. Have you ever seen a photograph of somebody's makeshift AC system in their car where they've taken a household wall mount or a household window mount AC system.
With a generator, right?
Yeah, it's hilarious.
Yeah, necessity.
But that kind of illustrates the point, right? You're talking about cubic feet of air that you need to cool inside the car, and you have to overcome that.
I always start my seminars with that with people. I mean, again, like we talked initially, the first thing you got to understand is you're cooling air within a controlled, sized environment. And being able to seal and insulate your vehicle is so critical because that shrinks the environment. If you're letting hot air in all the time, that environment gets larger all the time because you're continuing to grow the amount of cubic feet that you're trying to cool. So the more you can shrink that amount of cubic feet that you need to cool, the easier it's going to be for that air conditioner and heater in the wintertime to work.
Your units are more or less designed for installation by the owner, right? But and I guess what am I trying to ask? What's the most difficult part, would you say, of installing one of these systems?
I think the majority of our systems are still installed by the end user. I mean, it's changed in that, years ago, probably even more so. Now there's more shops doing it, friends doing it. But our especially our SureFit kits and everything, they're designed for the end user to install them. And we have videos and we have pretty detailed instructions and to make sure that and I always tell people if they're thinking about putting a system in their Camaro or they're thinking about, our instructions are all listed on our website. They're right there. You could download the instructions, look through them, see what all is involved, and know before you ever buy the kit or get going whether this is a job you think you can tackle in your shop. And because it's an involved installation, especially on the later model vehicles, because you're having to pull, in a lot of cases, the dash out of the car, depending on what it is. In a lot of that case, you're having to do that to remove the original system. Camaros, the first-gen Camaros, 67 to 69 Camaros, you pretty much have to pull the right front fender. And that's to get the old original heater and everything out of there. So they are somewhat involved, but, it all bolts together. So, we always tell guys, if you've been building a car, you're probably capable of doing the installation. And you break it up into chunks. You do the engine with the compressor at one, and the condenser kit is a second part of that. And then the inside air handler evaporator is kind of a third one. But there's varying level of complexities. In a lot of cases, the trucks are some of the simplest systems to install.
Is that just because there's a lot more room to work?
Sometimes a lot more room, but they're just simpler vehicles. There was less in them to begin with. 67 to 72 Chevy pickups, they're a pretty basic truck. And, there's not a lot under the dash, so they're easy to get to. A lot of the same with that with square body pickups and the Ford F-100s too. The trucks, there's just not a lot to them. They're a simpler vehicle, and that makes them simpler.
And then your kits that are model specific, you've pretty much followed the original engineering and design work of the OEM, right? So your systems more or less go where they would have originally.
Yeah, pretty much. One big difference in a lot of cases is in that the OEMs in a lot of cases put the blower motor out under the hood. And there are a couple different reasons for that. One was they took a little more space with it. Sometimes the maintenance was easier. And some of it was just noise. It was quiet. Having it out under the hood is quieter. But it does make it a little bit less efficient. And it also takes up engine compartment room that you maybe want to use for a larger engine or something like that. So, our whole evaporator system basically is an under dash system. So it's between the firewall and the dash in all cases. So a little bit different, but yeah, pretty much. And if it's a factory air vehicle and you're replacing an old factory air system with ours, we integrate into the factory air vents. So in a lot of cases, you can't even tell that the system's been replaced. If the system had a vacuum operated control or something like that, where you can't realistically convert it to electronic operation, we provide a control that pretty much mimics the look of the factory control that bolts right into that same position that kind of has that same overall look as the factory one. So we try to make the system, pretty similar to what the factory system would have looked like. And then if you want to change from there, you can change controls, you can change louvers, you can do a lot of things to customize the system. Yeah, but we try to make it so that you've got options.
One thing that people worry about with air conditioning in a car is the power loss, because that compressor is kind of robbing horsepower, right? Even if it's a freewheel clutch, you're still turning it, and that is a power loss. How much of that is a factor in these modern systems?
Man, it's not much of a factor at all anymore. Back in the 70s, 60s, 70s, when you started seeing, like you mentioned, some of those aftermarket systems, a lot of them used that old York Tecumseh compressor that looked like a lawnmower engine, and which is a very efficient compressor. But that was, that would take 7 to 8, 9 horsepower sometimes to run. Whereas a modern axial compressor, the Sandin style compressor that you see on so many vehicles, common aftermarket compressor, common OEM compressor, that's a 3 to 5 horsepower compressor under full load. So, it's really not taking a whole lot of horsepower, especially when you consider the horsepower numbers that you can generate on an engine now. It's so easy. But back in the 60s, 70s, especially in the 70s, and my daily driver now is a 87 Monte Carlo, old Aero Coupe that I've got. And, that had the, quote, high output motor for its time was 180 horsepower. That in the 80s, that was pretty sorry horsepower times. But you look at now, what you're buying now or the engines that you have now, 300 horsepower is just, that's the bottom of the thing. So if you're losing a few horsepower out of that, that's really not much.
The other thing I'm thinking of, Rick, is vacuum. It used to be that if you didn't have enough vacuum, your AC would basically cut out. Is that still a factor?
On the OEM systems, it can be, yeah, especially, but all of our systems are electronically controlled. We use OEM controllers, electronic controllers for the doors and for the heater controls. So vacuum isn't a factor at all in the system operation anymore.
Okay, good to know. So I know you've got a huge product line, but you're always looking to innovate, do new stuff. What's coming up next?
Well, a few years ago, I wouldn't have thought that we'd be doing kits for G-bodies like my Monte Carlo. And we're now just going to release this week, as a matter of fact, the upgraded Gen 5 kit for the G-bodies. And the latest new platform development we have in that's going to be done this summer is the Fox Body Mustangs. We're working on Fox Body Mustang kits. Like I said, we just released the OBS, just released the 82 to 92 Camaros. So we've got that third-gen Camaro out there now. And because everybody's idea of a hot rod's a little different, it all of it harkens back to nostalgia in a certain way. A lot of us are nostalgic to cars we either had as a kid or saw as a kid or anything else. And I got to tell you, when I started driving that, I had an old Aero Coupe years ago when they first came out. I liked them. I put 300,000 miles on one back in my simulator days and sold it. And I always kind of missed that car. I thought it was a cool looking race car. I thought it was a cool looking car. So a few years ago, I decided to get one again and just, again, use it for my basic daily driver. And I bought one in California a couple of years ago. And again, that's what I drive every day, most days, other than that or the 39. I'll stop with that 39 and put gas in. And then a few people will say something sometimes, but a lot of times it's just, that silly Monte Carlo. I'll stop at a gas station or the grocery store or something. I get more people talking about that Monte Carlo. Just, man, I remember so-and-so used to have one of these old things. And people have kind of they recognize that car from the 80s now, but that's, again, going on 40 years old, and that, 40 years ago and everything. And so my first 40 Chevy was basically 40 years old when I started playing around with it. And, that Monte Carlo is that now. So, the definition of what a specialty vehicle or a classic vehicle is changing all the time.
Yeah. And the demographic is changing, right? People are aged out. I love seeing a classic Monte Carlo on the road. It is rare now to see that.
They were very good cars to begin with, so a lot of cases. But, again, that back when I had that, there wasn't a lot of performance upgrades. But, I've got a whole suspension system I'm going to put on it from Detroit Speed. Coilovers and control arms and all of that. So, that's available. And, bigger brakes. And, eventually I'd like to LS the car. I think LS or LT is kind of in the long-term plan for it. But, man, the aftermarket is just exploding for things for those cars. And like I said, the third gen Camaros and the later model pickups. I mean, it's everybody's trying to be able to have things available for what people want to build.
Yeah, and you've seen the changing trends over the years, obviously. So,
no, I mean, there's the classics are always going to be the classics. A 32 Ford, I think a 40 Ford, those are always going to be classic cars. And Tri-5 Chevys are always going to be, first gen, second gen Camaros and, Mustangs, the early Mustangs and everything are always going to be ones that are going to draw people in. It doesn't matter the generation, they're always there. But we're continuing to add with it. Like I said, it's amazing to see the Fox bodies starting to catch on now the way they are. The number of parts available for those cars now, replaces parts.
Well, I think it's pretty cool what you guys do because, as I said earlier, being able to use your car year-round, especially if you're down in the Sun Belt, it's a big deal, and you've taken all the guesswork out of it for the builder.
Yeah, and what's cool is a lot of these cars you can use as daily drivers. I mean, we've got guys here that drive old cars every day to work, and it's another benefit from air conditioning. It's great to be cool, and I love the AC, but traffic is just so much heavier now, nearly everywhere from what it used to be, and when you can have the windows up and be able to listen to a podcast or listen to the radio, be able to talk, and not have that noise coming in, or boy, every time you pass an 18-wheeler, it's just roaring and that wind coming in and everything. When you're on a back road rolling down the windows every now and then may not be a bad thing to do, and it's kind of enjoyable. But man, when you're on the highway, that kind of wears you out. You feel like you're a wet rag when you get somewhere.
Rick, I can't remember what classic TV show it was, but I remember a bit on some show where the husband forced them to ride in the car with the windows up so that everyone would think they have AC. Does that ring a bell?
I've seen that. I'll make an admission. Several years ago, we were on a road tour. We do a road tour every year. Jack started that, 30 years ago now. We would go to a different place every year. We usually have 40 to 60 cars right in that range. And we were going out to the LA Roadster Show a few years ago, and I had a part fail on my 39. I had an expansion valve go bad, which is very rare, but it was the middle of that. This was June, and we were coming up. We had made a stop in Tombstone, at Old Town Tombstone, and we were going up to Tucson for the night. And coming out of Tucson, my AC quit working, and I was not going to put my windows down. It was 100 degrees outside, but I was not going to put my windows down until we got to the hotel. And fortunately, I was able to get it fixed the next day. I went to a dealer friend of ours there in Tucson and got the parts and got it fixed and everything. But I can relate to that because I wasn't going to be seen running down the road with my windows up.
Yeah, there was a time when if you had AC, like that was a really big deal.
Oh yeah, I still remember back in when I had my 40 Chevy in the late 70s. I remember going to a rod run, and the first car I saw was a 35 Chevrolet that had air conditioning in it. He had one of those old knee knocker underdashes that he had kind of assembled from parts from the junkyard, and I thought, my God, this guy put air conditioning on his hot rod. This is crazy. And now, I mean, I'll always love being at an event or being somewhere when you have a wife leading the husband up to the booth to talk to our guys or something like that, and she'll bring him up. And I've told him I'm not going to another event till that car's air conditioned. I'm not going anywhere in that car till it's air conditioned again. So, what does he need?
Yeah, exactly. Rick, you got any summer plans? Obviously, we're in the middle of classic car season, right? So I'm sure that work is going to be taking you to a number of events this year.
Yeah, we're going to go. I'll be at Good Guys Columbus and the Street Rod Nationals in Louisville. Looking forward to Columbus in a few weeks. That's always a good show. And I said Louisville, and then we've got our big road tour coming up in September. And I'm going to drive my 39 on that to a brand new event that's going to be in Nashville called the Triple Crown of Rodding. And it's a weekend after Labor Day. And I think that's going to be a really big event. They're going to have some of the best there from cars, and sounds like it's going to be a cool event. So we've got 70 cars on our road tour going this year. So I'm really looking forward to that. We've got a bunch of stops scheduled along the way, and trying to put some other plans together. I'm also a big history guy and World War II guy. So it's not this summer, but I've already got plans to go to Normandy next year for the 80th anniversary of D-Day. So actually going with my friend John McLeod from Classic Instruments, we're going there and planning to be over there for the D-Day festivities for the 80th. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I've promised to take my wife to Colorado again, maybe in the fall. So we've got that going too.
Good. Full schedule.
Yes. And what I always say is I hope everybody that's enjoying their car, gets out and enjoys it, because, driving the old cars is still, to me, what's the most fun about it. I mean, going to an event or a cruise night or something like that, I always have a good time there. But man, I have a good time going, and I have a good time just driving my old cars to work or around or things like that. And I think the more people that do that and really enjoy their cars, that's what we promote all the time. Is, man, get out and enjoy your cars, because you never know who you're going to meet through that too. Because I've met some of the greatest people just being at my old car when you have common interests like that.
Rick Love is the president of Vintage Air down in San Antonio, Texas. And if you want to learn more, the website is vintageair.com. I'll put links in the show notes, Rick, so people could just click on that. But hey, it was really fun talking with you today.
Enjoyed it as well. Hopefully we've answered a few questions and maybe raised a few more. But we also got guys on the phone every day, happy to answer questions and talk about it. So yeah, I've enjoyed it. Thanks for the visit.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. Don't forget, if you want to support the show with a donation, you can visit buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage, and you can throw a few bucks in the gas tank. Tell your friends about the show, write a review. All of that stuff helps me reach more gearheads like you. Let's all meet back here this Friday, August 11th, for a special bonus episode. My guest is Eric Minoff of Bonham's Cars, with a little preview of their quail auction. Good stuff. That's this Friday. So until then, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.